who have already joined for this Cornea Day 5 session, in which today we will be having presentations on viral keratitis and cross-linking. We have two very eminent, known nationally and internationally.
Allergic
conjunctivitis.
Allergic conjunctivitis and cross-linking. Dr. Quresh Muscati, who is well known nationally and internationally. He was our president of All India Ophthalmological Society and is very well known all over India, and especially is well known for conducting quiz during All India Ophthalmic Society, which is just loved, and it's such a super hit every year within the postgraduates. Sir will be talking about allergic conjunctivitis today. Sir is in Mumbai, and Dr. Love Kochgave will be introducing him further. We also have Dr. Rajesh Sinha, who is a professor at RP Center, All India Institute of Medical Science, New Delhi, who will be talking about cross-linking today, which will almost be in continuation of the presentation of what Dr. Namrata Sharma was talking day before yesterday. I'd like to also introduce Dr. Love Kochgave, who is a consultant at BBI Foundation, Kolkata, and known nationally and internationally for his presentations, especially in pediatric ophthalmology. Dr. Love Kochgave, please take over the session to introduce Dr. Quresh Muscati, the first speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Satyajit. First, at the outset, I would say that Dr. Satyajit, what you have organized is a gold mine for future PGs, and the kind of faculty you are arranging in all the specialities is really, really good and worth the effort what you are doing. And I would introduce the first speaker, though he doesn't need any introduction. All of us know him very, very well and very loved personality in All India Ophthalmological Society. Dr. Quresh Muscati, he was the president of All India Ophthalmic Society between 2014-15, and also he has been the president of International Society for Manual SICS between 2017 and 19. He has been the president of Cornea Society of India 17-19, and he has also been the president of Bombay Ophthalmic Association and president of Maharashtra Ophthalmic Association. He is also the chairman of AIUS, FBS AIUS 2019 onwards. So, sir, we would request you to please start with your deliberations.
Thank you, Love. And Satyajit, you see, when Satyajit first introduced the subject, he said that I will be speaking on viral keratitis. The issue is because all his webinars are going viral all around the world. So he has only this viral in him. So everything is viral to him. But we will talk about something which is more common than viral keratitis, and that is allergic conjunctivitis in our country. And to make sure that the slides ran well, we have outsourced the slides, not the content, but the running of the slides to a third party. So can I request Mr. Third Party, that's Manish from Intas, to show my slides? Thank you, Manish. So what we are dealing with, since this is a lecture for the postgraduates, let me first tell you that allergic conjunctivitis, one thing we love to do in ophthalmology and in medicine is to divide, subdivide, classify, subclassify. So we need to do this. Next slide. So before we begin to talk, we must classify it. So basically, what are we dealing under the broad umbrella of allergic conjunctivitis? This is the monsoon season in India, so we have umbrellas. So under the broad umbrella of allergic conjunctivitis, you have two acute disorders which go under the names of SAC and PSC, that's seasonal allergic conjunctivitis, and perennial allergic conjunctivitis. These are both IgE mediated, basically type 1 reactions. We'll see what that means. And you have three chronic disorders, of which we worry about the first two, that's vernal keratoconjunctivitis or vernal conjunctivitis, and atopic keratoconjunctivitis or atopic conjunctivitis. If the cornea is affected, we call it atopic keratoconjunctivitis. If not, we say atopic conjunctivitis. GPC is a little different from these, but it is put under the same group because it is both IgE and non-IgE mediated, like the other two. So VKC, AKC, and giant papillary conjunctivitis are all type 1 plus type 4 reactions, or IgE and non-IgE mediated. Next. So let's talk about the first group, the seasonal and the perennial allergic conjunctivitis. This varies markedly from depending on the geography. So there are certain countries like in Italy, Japan, where you have more of these than in other countries. What is common to all these is histamine is the primary contributor. The enemy agent, the bad guy in the group is histamine. And all our problems in these, in SSC and PSC are derived from the release of histamine when we don't want it there. So this histamine causes all the signs and symptoms of allergic conjunctivitis. And the more the allergens, the more the histamine release and the more severe the symptoms. And this is mediated by immunoglobulin E. Next. While VKC and AKC are more complex. So SSC and PSC were little simple, IgE mediated, more the allergens, more the exposure, more the disease. VKC and AKC are chronic allergic disease. That means that even after the exposure is not there or the allergen is not there, they continue to sort of self-perpetuate and become chronic. That is because it's a very complex mechanism, unlike the simple histamine release in the SAC, the seasonal allergic type. So here you get eosinophils, conjunctival fibroblasts, epithelial cells, mast cells, Th2 lymphocytes, all these are implicated. So the allergy incites inflammation, which incites an endocrine response and causes immune stimulus. So it causes multiple dysfunctions in the biochemistry and histology of the conjunctiva. So the actual layout of the conjunctiva is also disturbed. And research has documented that histaminase deficiency, the enzyme which can break down histamine. So histamine is the bad guy. So histaminase, any enzyme which breaks down histamine, is the good guy. So unfortunately in VKC, they found evidence that there is deficiency of histaminase. So the histamine remains there for longer. Next. So let's talk about these bad types, the vernal keratoconjunctivitis. So in this, males to female ratio is 3:1, more affecting kids and young adults. Vernal means spring. So it's also known as spring catarrh. In our country, we don't have these months except in the extreme north. So we don't have much of these seasons. So it has both, as I told you, the IgE, which is called type 1 hypersensitivity, and the non-specific hypersensitivity, which is called type 4. And the tier IgE levels are increased in about 60% of the cases. And you can even measure these IgE levels by microassay. Doesn't help you much because 40% of the cases can be IgE negative, where the preponderance is of the type 4 type of hypersensitivity. So you have increased conjunctival B cells as well. So if you do a little bit of biopsy, this is what you would find. Next. While atopic keratoconjunctivitis occurs more frequently in men aged 30 to 50. So here also males predominate. And there is sometimes very often a family history of different types of allergies. So you could be having allergic rhinitis, allergic asthma, urticaria, or a skin allergy. Hay fever is often present. So many of these have, and some of the other allergies besides the eye allergy, they start very early, even before the age of 5 years. So a child of 5 years or less could have bronchial asthma, allergic rhinitis, and the ocular symptoms could come later. So the primary symptom of atopic keratoconjunctivitis is intense bilateral itching of the lid, skin, and periorbital area. So it's not only the conjunctiva. So whenever you find that the periorbital area, the skin of the lids is also affected, you must suspect that it is more likely to be an atopic type, especially if there is associated asthma or rhinitis or skin allergies. Next. Next, yeah. So atopic shows again, as I told you, both the immediate type 1 allergy and the chronic proliferative changes, which is type 4. The 30% of the cases are pediatric. Japan has a high prevalence of atopic keratoconjunctivitis, almost 3.5% of the population. So it's common to find in these, as I told you, it's a very complex condition. So later on, you can get cicatrizing changes, something mimicking even pemphigus. You can have a severe affection of the cornea, and there's a high risk of infection because these children tend to rub their eyes a lot because of the intense itching, not only in the eye, but of the skin around. So they tend to be very chronic rubbers. and they are therefore predisposed to keratoconus. So if at all they have the gene for keratoconus, or like there is the Frenchman called Dr. Damien Gatinel, who believes that every keratoconus is because of eye rubbing. So patients with atopic keratoconjunctivitis are very prone to keratoconus. Almost 35% of them will develop keratoconus because of the severe eye rubbing, which is more than in any other type of allergic conjunctivitis. In Japan, 30% of AKC is in the pediatric age group. Next. So what are the trigger factors for allergy? The trigger factors are substances called allergens. That's why we call it allergy, because the trigger factors are allergens. In vernal conjunctivitis, in spring catarrh, you could have high pollen counts. So in the US, on the FM radio, they actually announced that today the pollen count is so much, so that those who got a tendency to allergy stay indoors on those days. So high pollen counts from the flowers and the leaves you can get. It could be pollution, certain animals. Dust mites are very common in India. You see the picture on top right. That's a dust mite which has been blown out of proportion. So dust mites, because we have a lot of dust in our country, pollution and all that. So we get a lot of dust mites causing allergy in our country. The other thing we find is a lot of cockroaches in our country. So typically in India, we get cockroach related and dust mite related allergy. But otherwise it could be sun, the dust, wind, high temperatures, pressures, overuse of computers, any pollution due to smoke, the chulas which are there, the open fire chulas, anything which causes release of free radicals and oxidative stress, and some amount of genetics is also involved. These are all various trigger factors. I had one patient who had chocolate as a trigger factor, another patient who had bangan or brinjal as a trigger factor. So it could be some vegetable, some fruit, some food item. We keep discovering, and there are people who do allergy testing and they use a packet of 84 allergens to test, and some of them have even 160 allergens which they test, which is quite painful for the child because you have to scratch the skin and put the allergen there for testing. Next. So the surface inflammation is mast cell driven. So mast cell is the key cell in this. In the acute phase, there is itching, tearing, there is edema of the lids, the conjunctiva, some amount of chemosis. So that is the time that you'll get the maximum symptoms of redness and photophobia. And classic, there is a late phase in a subset, but later on you can get the chronic disease, especially in the atopic and the vernal keratoconjunctivitis. Next. So let us see exactly how the type 1 hypersensitivity, classical hypersensitivity responds. So there is an airborne allergen. Let us assume it is this dust mite, which is the antigen. Now this antigen combines with IgE. The IgE antibodies are membrane bound. They're on the membrane, the cell wall. So they attach to receptors. You see that Y-shaped receptor next to the word response in the slide. So these are receptors. Imagine this Y-shaped things outside on the mast cell. You see the mast cell on the lower right. So that mast cell, on top of that, can you imagine those projections, those Y-shaped receptors over there waiting to catch the antigen. So the antigen goes and sits in the crotch of the Y. When it sits on the crotch of the Y, that Y-shaped receptor presses on the mast cell and breaks the wall of the mast cell. So when it breaks the wall of the mast cell, that's because the antigen and antibody have combined in that Y. And when it presses on the mast cell, there are granules inside the mast cell. Those granules get released. You can see the artist picture on the lower right of the mast cell from which the granules of greenish blue structures are coming out. Now those granules contain some very nasty substances called mediators. So those granules are released from the mast cell, and those granules in turn release the mediators. Next. So when those mediators are released, what are the mediators? Tryptase, heparin, but the most powerful and the baddest guy of them all, as I said, is histamine, which are now released into the extracellular matrix, means outside the cell, because they have left the mast cell, if you remember. Now these mediators, they start a cascade of biochemical events which lead to formation of new mediators. What are the new mediators? Certain prostaglandins and leukotrienes. Now leukotrienes, leukos means white, that means they attract the white blood cells. So they cause the blood vessels which are around to start leaking. And these leaking blood vessels then cause an influx of inflammatory cells into the conjunctival mucosa. So imagine that poor dust mite didn't know what it would cause. It came and sat in that Y, caused an antigen antibody complex to press on the mast cell, which release the mediators. The mediators such as histamine and heparin and others started a whole cascade of events, caused the blood vessels to leak, the binding of the endothelial cells of the vessels to leak, and this caused release of chemokines, influx of inflammatory cells, and the whole cycle got perpetuated. Next. So this was the typical type 1 reaction. Next. So shield ulcers are a little different. So we talked about type 1 and type 4. What happens in shield ulcers? It works by, shield ulcer is a usually sterile ulcer in the cornea, excited by a palpable variety of the allergic conjunctivitis. So you have these papillae on the allergic conjunctivitis on the inner surface of the lid, and these cause a mechanical irritation to the cornea because they're very large, giant papillae. So these shield ulcers are created by a combination of mechanical irritation and toxic epitheliopathy from the inflammatory mediators secreted by the eosinophils and mast cells from the type 1 reaction. So combination of mechanical pressure and the toxic epitheliopathy, it's found only in very severe forms of VKC, and this is usually sterile but can get secondarily infected. And you find various cellular adhesion molecules. Cellular adhesion molecules is CAM, ICAM, including intracellular molecular adhesion molecules, that is ICAM1, are released into the conjunctiva of patients with VKC. Next, in these shield ulcers. Let's now go, having understood that it can be a type 1 or a type 4. Most of the classical changes have been described in type 1. Type 4 is more of a chronic change, and in which the IgE may not be involved. It may not be mediated through IgE. The treatment, however, of the entire umbrella of allergic conjunctivitis remains the same. So it's only for your exam purposes that you need to distinguish between the various types of allergic conjunctivitis. But irrespective of the type, whatever the type of allergic conjunctivitis, your treatment will be the same. It consists of pharmacologic and non-pharmacologic treatment. The non-pharmacologic is simple. Avoid the allergens. That means when the FM radio in the US says pollen count is high, don't go out. So then you will not get the itching. Simple cold compresses, either a cold towel or a cold napkin, or even ice in a handkerchief can be used to apply cold compresses. It dampens or reduces the inflammation. Another thing is, if you've got a cold compress on the eye, you're less likely to itch because your eye is closed. Artificial lubricants, we'll see the details of all these later. And pharmacologic, which is a whole host of drugs. It could be antihistaminic drugs, which are important because we told you histamine is the chief villain of the piece. Vasoconstrictors, because I told you that blood vessels start leaking and dilate. So anything which causes a vasoconstriction will cause less leakage from the blood vessels. Then mast cell stabilizers, because I told you that the mast cell starts leaking the granules. So anything which will stabilize the mast cell can be used. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs are useful, chief among them being ketorolac. Then there are dual action drugs, which are both mast cell stabilizers as well as antihistaminic in action. And of course, you have the big, strong corticosteroids, which will say, tum khade raho, tum log sab dur ho jao, main theek karta hu, because corticosteroids can get rid of anything. But we shouldn't be doing too much of it, of betamethasone, dexa, and so on. And sometimes you might have to give even oral antihistaminics. If, for example, if the mother is extremely anxious and the child is not getting well and the mother is getting sleeplessness, then you can give the child oral antihistaminics and the mother a sleeping tablet. And sometimes you might, if there is allergic rhinitis, you might treat with nasal the sprays as well of some steroids. And then there are some certain specific therapies. We'll go into the details next. So the treatment options are, you identify and diminish the exposure to the offending antigen. As I told you, staying indoors with pollen count high, it's often impractical. For example, if somebody is working in a chemical factory and the chemical fumes are causing allergy, you can't tell him to change his job because he will ask you for one. And in these COVID times, jobs are difficult to find. So don't ever tell patients to change jobs. Then cold compresses, I told you, can be extremely useful. Two reasons. It avoids the customary irrational rubbing response. That means that even when there's no allergy, the child gets a habit of rubbing his eye. So that is avoided by having a cold compress or an ice cube or 2 ice cubes in a handkerchief. And the sunglasses is again good, especially tight fitting sunglasses in children, so they can wiggle their dirty finger through the sunglasses to scratch their eyes. And improving hygiene. So in these COVID times, we know frequent hand wash is good. Avoidance of eye rubbing is good for COVID as well as for allergy. Next. Then there is desensitization therapy. I reserve desensitization for those who have got atopic keratoconjunctivitis, where there is a skin allergy as well as some allergy to the nose, allergic rhinitis, pruritus, something like that, or bronchial asthma. Then it makes sense to do a systemic therapy so that you can get rid of all the three problems, the skin lesion, the asthma, the rhinitis, as well as the eye allergy in one shot. If there's only an eye allergy, then you can treat it just locally. So in desensitization, first you have to find out what is the allergen that they are sensitive to. So you have skin prick tests, intradermal tests, and mucosal challenge tests. So you have to stop all medicines before you do these tests. And once you find out, if you find out predominantly he is allergic to chocolate, for example, or predominantly is allergic to dust mite, then the doctors, the allergy specialists can prepare a sublingual therapy or intramuscular desensitization, in which they give small doses of the same allergen to excite an inflammatory response in the body or an immune response in the body, which is a good thing, and gradually increase the strength of the allergen which they are giving. So there is gradual desensitization. Total process lasts about 2 to 3 months. So it's a long drawn process with multiple intramuscular injections, but it does work when there is multiple allergies. Next. So the mainstay of treatment, again, before we go to specific treatment, what about artificial tears? They're very good because they provide a barrier function and help to improve the first line defense at the level of the conjunctival mucosa itself. So the allergens get diluted, the inflammatory mediators like histamine which are released get washed away, get diluted, and the ocular surface is flushed off everything. So it's a good thing. And chill tears is better. Anything cold going into the eye for allergic conjunctivitis is always more tolerated than a room temperature one. So see if they can refrigerate it and use this. It gives a little enhanced relief. Next. Moving on to specific treatments. Recently, a drug called Rebamipide started being available in India for the last few years. And they found out quite by accident, like Viagra was discovered by accident. It was an antihypertensive they were looking for. Similarly, Rebamipide 4 times a day is usually used as to stimulate the mucin secretion from the goblet cells. So it's one of the lubricants used in dry eye to stimulate the secretion of better quality tears. And it was found to have an anti-allergic effect as well as lubricating. So it's an adjunct therapy, never the only therapy, but 4 times a day it can be safely used for 2 to 3 months at a stretch. Next. Then there are some newer antihistaminics. Now these don't do anything to the mast cells, they just block the histamine over there. So you can have local histamine, which is H1 receptors. H1 is more useful than H2 receptors. So if something blocks H1 receptors, it's better than if it blocks H2. So, but it gives you symptomatic relief. So whatever histamine has been released, it is blocked. So short duration. So you have to put it every hour, every 2 hours if you want real relief from the itching. And it has no effect on mast cell degranulation. So previously we didn't have anything to stabilize the mast cells. So we would give a lot of antihistaminic medicines. But giving oral antihistaminics has a problem because it causes drowsiness, dry mouth. So it could be only given at night. Next. Next, yeah. Then there is non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. They do block the action of cyclooxygenase, so one of the inflammatory pathways, and they inhibit the conversion of arachidonic acid to prostaglandins. So I told you that in the biochemical cascade from the histamine which was released, then there was a conversion into leukotrienes and so on. and one of the mediators was prostaglandin. So the conversion of arachidonic acid to prostaglandin and thromboxanes is reduced by NSAIDs. So they do have some efficacy compared with placebo, but not too much. They're rather mild as compared to some of the other drugs that we have. So again, NSAIDs can be used as an adjunct, but never as the mainstay, and is less effective than even topical antihistamines. Next. Next, yeah. Then you have mast cell stabilizers. So you have pure mast cell stabilizers. So you see the picture on the upper right where the mast cell is releasing those granules. So you have mast cell stabilizers called like cromolyn sodium, which was available. The others are not available in our country. So they are an option for patients with seasonal allergic. So you can give it even in advance when you know that the pollen season is coming. So somebody who's got a seasonal allergic conjunctivitis which comes only in a particular season, you can even start the treatment 2 to 4 weeks before the onset of the season so that the mast cells get stabilized. But please understand that no matter what you do, if there are 100 mast cells in the conjunctiva, there is no drop which will stabilize 100 mast cells. So out of 100, 80 may get stabilized, 20 will still release the granules, and so the histamine and so on. So you will need the mast cell stabilizers and antihistaminics at the same time. Only mast cell stabilizers will not solve the problem. The patient will itch, though a little less. Next. So therefore, ideally, next. So the standard treatment now is a medicine called DAD. We just celebrated Father's Day a couple of days ago. But DAD here refers to what is called as dual action drugs. Dual action drugs is something which has antihistaminic, which is a potent H1 receptor. Remember, I told you that H1 is more important to block than H2, and it has mast cell stabilizing. So this should be a wonder drug. So examples of them are olopatadine, alcaftadine, bipotestine, azilastine, epinestine, and ketotifen. Mercifully, all of these are available in our country. Some of them are marketed more, some are marketed less by people, but almost all of these are available in India. Next. So antihistaminics with mast cell stabilizing properties, they block histamine, and therefore they also reduce the late phase of the allergic response, and they inhibit mast cell degranulation as well. Next. So the onset of action is quite rapid. So it's within minutes. So they're very fast acting. And before you label it, it is not working in my child, at least 2 weeks of therapy should be allowed in order to assess the full efficacy. And as I said, using them refrigerated is much better. All these dual action drugs are mercifully only once a day or twice a day dosage. So it's quite, compliance is not such a problem. Next. The commonly used dual action drugs are olopatadine. Epinestine came in a big way, and now for some reason it's not so well marketed, but I like the drug, it's still good. Olopatadine is available both as once a day 0.2% and twice a day, that's double strength. 0.2% is double strength, and twice a day dosage, which is 0.1%. Epinestine did work, but it's not so freely available. And the new kids on the block are bipotestine and alcaftadine. Next. So this is the launch year of different dual action drugs. Olopatadine is the oldest kid with 1996. Then alcaftadine came in 2010. Azilastine, which came and went away in 2000. Epinestine in 2003, not being marketed too much. Ketotifen is a very weak dual action drug. It's part of the NSAIDs, but it does act on the mast cells. The other NSAIDs act only on as an antihistaminic, and that too very weak. And bipotestine, which came in almost at the same time as alcaftadine, though in India, alcaftadine came a little later than bipotestine. Next. So let's talk about some of the newer ones. We already know that olopatadine works. So bipotestine is similar in the sense that it is also twice a day. It's a 1.5% solution. It's bipotestine becylate. So the full name is bipotestine becylate. It's quite a tongue twister of a name. Next. So they did 2 phase 3 trials. So first they compared it to placebo. One of the best things to do is to compare a drug to placebo, because you know that even if it's mildly effective, it will be better than placebo. So they did it, and they found they took 78 patients on BBOS, that is Bepotestin Bacillate Ophthalmic Solution, 1.5%, or placebo, and each of the subjects received one eye drop of the test agent in both the eyes, and they was tested at different times. Next, prior to CAC is a conjunctival challenge, antigenic challenge. So what are the endpoints? What are the changes in ocular itching and hyperemia? These were assessed at 3, 5, and 7 minutes. And conjunctival hyperemia was assessed at 7, 15, and 20 minutes following a conjunctival antigen challenge. And there were secondary endpoints as well. We won't go into details. Next. So they found a statistically significant reduction in ocular itching with BBOS compared to placebo, and that the effect persisted for 8 hours. And conjunctival hyperemia was also significantly reduced compared to placebo. So the itching and the hyperemia, which were the two endpoints, it was proved that it started early and it persisted for 8 hours. Next. So the secondary health points were also significantly improved, and the adverse effects were mild. Next. So the original concoction is Bepreve by Bausch & Lomb. Of course, we have our own generic forms available in India. 2 or 3 companies are making this now. So the onset of action is within 3 minutes, so it's quite fast. Sizable proportion reported complete relief from itching even at 16 hours. So as I said, ideal is 8 hours, but even at 16 hours, a sizable proportion, and they tried different concentrations. They found 1.5% superior to 1%. So now everywhere in the world you get 1.5%, and dosage is twice a day, and it is FDA approved for treatment of itching. For prevention, it is off-label. So, you know, FDA is very touchy about what it says is on-label and off-label. So if you want to prevent itching, it is off-label. If you want to treat itching, you're on-label. Next. So it acts, as I said, it's dual action. So it's a selective antagonist of histamine 1, that is H1 receptor, and it's a mast cell stabilizer, so which is a great thing. It suppresses the migration of eosinophils into the inflamed tissues, inhibits the production of IL-5. IL-5 is part of the villains. So Gabbar Singh's army in Sholay, one of the army men, the Samba is IL-5. To prevent, so the less the production of IL-5, the less the tissue damage, and the better, the less the inflammation which will occur. So it suppresses this. Next, this is how it acts. So then they said, let us now, we've compared it to placebo, it works. Let's see whether it works compared to olopatadine, which was the reigning champion in that time, 2000, olopatadine come out, which was 0.2% at that time. And they said, let's compare it between the two. Next. So when they did this, the comparison between Bepotestin Bacillate 1.5% and olopatadine 0.2%, that is the higher strength once a day. So once a day should be more compliance and more tolerated. And they did this study for 14 days. Next. And it was randomized, observer mass, single center crossover. 30 patients were treated with ocular itching with allergic conjunctivitis. Next. So then they did a 7-day washout period in which only artificial tears were used, and then they shifted the patient to the other one. So if he was on Bepotestin, he was then after 7-day washout treated with olopatadine, and vice versa. And what were the parameters they used was the ability to relieve ocular itching, and all of them had runny nose as well, itchy and runny nose in this study, 30 patients. And so they found what was the ability to relieve the rhinitis as well, and how comfortable was the thing. So itching, runny nose, other symptoms of allergy, and eye drop comfort. So these were the endpoints. Next. And patients were also asked to identify which agent provided better all-day relief and so on. Next. And which one would they prefer? And at the end of this, they found that almost 2/3 of the patients preferred the BBOS, that is a Bepotestin Bacillate. 63%, 66% preferred this for all-day relief of ocular itching and of itchy and runny nose. So for both these, it scored over the olopatadine. As far as comfort is concerned, both were comfortable. The once-a-day olopatadine and the twice a day bipotestin, both were comfortable and there was no difference between the two. So it's not that olopatadine is inferior as far as comfort is concerned. Next. Because you must always read between the lines in these studies. The studies are usually sponsored by the guy who has the better effect, in this case, bipotestin. So olopatadine has a little weaker effect as compared to bipotestin on eosinophil chemotaxis. So when they did histopath, they found this. And bipotestin was more potent than olopatadine in animal models of allergic conjunctivitis. So this is now deviating from the study that they did. This is in vitro studies. And understand that bipotestin is not superior to olopatadine in reducing conjunctival hyperemia. So for ocular comfort, I told you it's the same. Conjunctival hyperemia, red eye reduction, it's the same. It is not superior. It is only the patients preferred it for 24-hour comfort. Next. So bipotestin was then compared to L-caftidine. So now the guys who made bipotestin got quite chad out that it's worked in placebo. It's worked against olopatadine, of course, with caveats that in certain things it was not inferior, but not superior either. They said, now let's compare it with L-caftidine, because L-caftidine is also, it's only 0.25% and you need to put it only once a day. Next. So they said, let's compare this. So they did again a single center study, 25 subjects they enrolled with a history of allergic conjunctivitis, and that they had an acute attack. They were symptomatic within the 3 days prior to enrollment. And they were given 1 drop of a randomized medication in the right eye, immediately followed by 1 drop of the alternative medication in the left eye. So this was an interesting study. One eye got the bipotestin, one eye got the L-caftidine, and they administered. Next. So at all time points post installation, bipotestin was more comfortable than L-caftidine. The largest disparity in comfort between the two was at 1 minute. So if immediately after, at 1 minute, if you ask the patient, he's just put the drop, he's simply recovering from the drop having been put, and then you shake him and say, no, you tell me left eye, right eye better, which one is better? He said, well, the eye with the bipotestin statistically was more comfortable at 1 minute. But at later time points, the statistical difference was not so much. So 84% of L-caftidine patients had some level of discomfort at 1 minute versus 12% of bipotestin patients. So after putting the drop, you know that many patients, even sometimes for 2 to 3 minutes, may have discomfort. So that is where the bipotestin guys score and said at 1 minute, we are more comfortable. Next. So at 1 minute, significant difference. However, bipotestin, again, they're saying the same thing, but this is all at 1 minute. Next. So patients preferred bipotestin over olopatadine, and this is the conclusion. They chose efficacy over convenience, and they preferred BBOS to L-caftidine only at the 1 minute post installation. Adverse effects: 10% of patients on bipotestin have a mild adverse taste, not requiring stoppage of treatment. So that is a side effect of BPOS of bipotestin, which is not there in L-caftidine and olopatadine. Next. What about moving on from there to calcineurin inhibitors? Calcineurin inhibitors is a big name for basically cyclosporin and tacrolimus. So in our country, luckily we have 2% cyclosporin available as eye drops only from Oralab. So that works in allergic conjunctivitis. And we have 0.01% ophthalmic solution of tacrolimus. This is also available from various people, not only from Oralab. I have no financial interest in any company. If you don't get it, when before it was available, we were using skin ointment, which was 0.03%. We would put it on the skin outside of the lower lid before the patient went to sleep, and it would penetrate through the skin during sleep and go into the eye, because it is quite irritant if you kept it in the eye. Even 0.01%, the ophthalmic solution of tacrolimus ointment is a little irritant. So also is 2% cyclosporin. You can dilute the 2% cyclosporin to make it 1% in a lubricant, and it's still quite effective. But don't go below 1%, then it doesn't act in allergy. Advantage of this is that they can be used for several months, even for years, on a continuous basis as steroid-sparing agents. And they are immunosuppressive. They block Th2 lymphocyte proliferation and interleukin-2 production. and reduce IL-5. Remember IL-5 I called the Samba of the Gabbar Singh gang. So it inhibits the histamine release from the mast cell. So they're quite powerful. They are also dual action. Next. Then deliberately I have kept the corticosteroids towards the last part of my talk because that is the last thing you should use, and you should use this only when everything else fails. So corticosteroids do remain the most potent pharmacological agent which we can use. They act at multiple points. At the first step of the arachidonic acid pathway, they inhibit phospholipase, which is responsible for converting membrane phospholipid into arachidonic acid. So arachidonic acid is the start. So when you stop it at that level itself, they block both the cycle, because from arachidonic acid, you get the cyclooxygenase path and the lipooxygenase path. So when you block it at the arachidonic acid level itself, you block both these paths. Nothing else blocks both the paths except steroid. That's why it acts very well, but it has its side effects. Next. So they do have limitations. You can get secondary infection. You know that you can get glaucoma, worsening of dry eye. And we've all, those of us who are senior enough, have seen our patients self-medicating with this for years on end and coming with bilateral mature cataracts in a 12-year-old, where we had to do cataract surgery. We've done glaucoma valve surgery in these patients because of abuse of these steroids. Next. So where do we place steroids? Only in severe refractory cases, always as supplemental therapy. So I would prefer to use it as a pulse therapy. So use it 1 hourly, a surface acting steroid like loteprednol or fluoromethalone or diluted dexamethasone, even 1 hourly or 2 hourly, not more than 3 to 7 days, very rapidly taper. At the same time, you continue the other medicines that you're giving like olopatadine or bepotestin, so that the other medicines can act once the acute phase goes down. And always counsel the patients on the ill effects of steroids and scare them a bit. Next. So surgical options are reserved for refractory cases of mainly palpable spring catarrh with minimal or no bulbar involvement. If there is only more of a palpable, like you can see in the picture there, then you can excise the papillae or even scrape the papillae. And then I take buccal mucosa from the mouth. From the lower lip, I take buccal mucosa. I'm used to doing this because I do Pintucci keratoprosthesis. So from the mouth, I take this, thin it out quite a bit and apply it from end to end in the palpable conjunctiva. So it dampens down the inflammation quite a bit. Next, the other surgical option is tarsal triamcinolone, which can be given into the papillae itself. Triamcinolone can be given about, you get 40 milligram per ml, and you can give about half an ml of triamcinolone. It can cause glaucoma in some patients, but if nothing else works, a long-acting depot preparation can be given. What about shield ulcers? The management of shield ulcers is a little different. You need to continue the treatment of allergic conjunctivitis with topical steroids if the ulcer is not infected. And because we know it can get infected, you might want to add antibiotics when you're putting steroids in a shield ulcer. If the base is opaque, then the steroid will not act so well. So do a gentle debridement of the shield ulcer. Sometimes there is a plaque over it. So you need to remove the plaque, and you can add, as I said, supratarsal steroids and continue the steroid antibiotic drops. And if you remove the plaque and you find that the base is very thin and it's about to perforate or it's non-healing, you can do an amniotic membrane graft. There are various techniques. Multiple bits of amnion can be put, onlay, inlay techniques. We won't go into details. Next. To summarize, my management technique is I explain about hygiene, the importance of hygiene. I put the patient on low strength steroids when he first comes with a rapid taper over a few days. I start the patient on bepotestin and ask him to continue it for 2 years. In our country, we get very rarely we get waves of the allergy. It usually persists for the whole year. It's perennial. So I ask the patient to continue for 2 years, even if it's asymptomatic, because the mast cells, new mast cells which are coming there, all get stabilized. And when the attack is less severe, and bepotestin for long time, or even olopatadine or L-caftadine for years on end doesn't do any harm. And suppose he's on bepotestin and there is this mild attack, then I could use an NSAID, which is a mild one like ketorolac, to take care of the antihistaminic, the itching part. So you're adding a mild antihistaminic and mast cell stabilizer as an additional treatment for as long as necessary, maybe 10, 15 days. When there is no more itching, you can stop the ketorolac. Next. If the patient still needs topical steroids, you can't do without it. Then I will put the patient on tacrolimus drops, ointment at night, maybe for 3 to 6 months. Though I have used it for 3 years without a problem. And you can use orosporin, which is 2% cyclosporin once or twice a day. As I said, you can dilute to 1% or too much burning. And these have been used, they have published reports of being used up to 7 years without a problem continuously. So it's a steroid sparing agent. And in all these, you can use ketorolac drops 3 to 4 times a day till the itching stops, more as an antihistaminic. Next. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll be happy, Satya, to answer questions. And for those who are sleeping, it's time to wake up because there's an interesting surgical lecture coming up by Dr. Rajesh Sinha on collagen cross-linking. Thank you.
It was of real interest to me because I face these patients almost on daily basis. Sir,
Thank you, doctor.
main combination, what do you use? Like, you told that steroid should be the last, but parents generally are not that patient for them to see whether olopatadine acts or not because it takes time.
Yeah. So what you do is any patient with severe allergy who comes, you first put the patient on a low dose surface acting steroid like loteprednol or fluoromethalone and ask them to continue I put them on 2 hourly. If the patient is virgin, that means I am the first eye surgeon. Usually I'm not, only 10% of cases I'm the first eye surgeon. So usually has gone to 5 or 6 because allergic conjunctivitis never goes away. So only the doctor goes away, the patient goes away. So patient goes to different doctors. So I'm usually the 6th or the 7th doctor they've come to. So they in their bag, they've got some steroids, they've got everything. So I pick and choose. I tell them, okay, these drops, you put it because nobody's put it every hour or every 2 hours. They usually put steroids because they're scared. So they put it on 3 times a day. So I tell them, put it every 2 hours for the first 3 days. So the patient is khush because in every 2 hours, no matter what allergy, it's better. So he says, this is a good doctor. But I tell him at the same time, you add the olopatadine or you add the alcaftidine or the bipotestine. And if it's a severe allergy, I'll tell him at night, just put the tacrolimus before sleeping. And I tell him that since this is the first time the steroid, so then I tell him that over about 10 days or so, the 2 hourly becomes once a day. Very rapid taper of the steroid. But in those 10 days, the tacrolimus also starts taking effect. The bipotestine also starts taking effect. And what I do is I give them this ketorolac low strength. We get 2-3 companies which are making ketorolac low strength. It's a good antihistaminic. So I've stopped using any other antihistamine. So I put this 4 times a day. So the itching goes down with ketorolac 4 times a day. And the mast cells are stabilized with your dual action and with your steroid and with this. So then in 10 days, you taper the steroid. Then I tell him this was the first time, so 10 din karne diya. Next time you get this, now suppose in June you have used it, you will now use steroid only in July. If at all, if it's a severe attack, then you will use it only for 5 days. So then I tell him you start 4 times a day and taper it over 5 days to once a day and stop. And then you will use it only in August. So whenever there are acute exacerbations, they use steroids only in a pulsed form. But the rest of the time, the other things
not
are
beyond 1 week.
Not beyond a week.
Steroid.
Never beyond a week. And everything else is continuing. So I might use orosporin and tacrolimus. Orosporin in the morning, tacrolimus at night. And the ketorolac you can use for 15 days, 20 days. It doesn't matter. As long as there is itching, they use it. So they feel they're using something. And I'm a great proponent of ice compresses with handkerchief. Mother feels happy because she feels that she is doing something very active with the child, besides putting 1 drop and forget it.
I also got one answer which I was always finding that how long we can use cyclosporin.
Both these are published reports. The published reports say that the cyclosporin drops can be used for 7 years and the tacrolimus can be used for 3 years. At least people have used it without side effects. So
that would definitely change in my practice. I would start using that more often.
Absolutely. Just go ahead. As I've used it. I've not published anything, but I have used both these for more than 5 years at a stretch. Yeah.
Any questions from the PTs?
One is there, what is pseudo genotoxin?
Pseudogerontoxin is just, see, the ring around the limbus that you get because of the bulbar variety of the allergic conjunctivitis, that is referred to by many as a pseudogerontoxin. It's just terminology which is used.
Sir, there is one question about when do you use 0.05 cyclosporin and 0.2 cyclosporin?
Let me make it very clear. I never use 0.05. 0.05 cyclosporin is what came in as Restasis right in the about 15 years ago, and that is reserved for dry eye. So the original Allergan studies were on 0.05% and 0.1%, and they found that there is no difference. So they used the 0.05%. After that, many companies in India have come out with multi-dose and nano suspension, but these are all for dry eye patients. So many of your allergic patients will have dry eye. Yes, you can use this, but not for the allergy. For the allergy, you must use 1% and more. So minimum 20 times the dose, the strength of the available cyclosporin, which is available for dry eye.
That is available with Orolab.
Only at the moment with Orolab, which is very poor in marketing. So I normally order it from Madurai and they send me a box of 12. And then I dispense it to my patients free of charge. So it's not available in the market, not sold at chemist shops, but it's a wonderful drug. And if 2% is not tolerated, you can dilute it 1:1 with CMC or something.
Mic is off, Satyajit.
My mic is off.
Thank you so much for your presentation, sir. The presentation was so exhaustive. The postgraduates won't need to open their books when they have to answer this major question. In between your talk, you mentioned Father's Day. And I thought it would be relevant to share some history with the postgraduates who are listening to this talk. Dr. Quresh Muscati and his dad, who was very, very highly respected Professor B.T. Muscati, they are the only father-son duo in All India Ophthalmological Society who have held the highest chair in the country, both father and son. There is no other father and son duo who has chaired this All India Ophthalmic Society President's chair. So it's a great...
Satyajit decides to stand for elections.
My dad was a close friend of your dad. So since kid time, I've been seeing your dad. So thank you so much, sir, for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Dr. Love, I would like to request you to introduce the next speaker, please.
So next we have Professor Rajesh Sinha, who is professor in ophthalmology, and he also doesn't need any introduction at all. Just for completion's sake, I would be mentioning few of his achievements. Most important, what I see is he has 334 publications and 3 textbooks. That is an achievement. Anyone who has tried to publish, they will know what it is. And apart from that, he has received the American Achievement Award from the American Academy of Ophthalmology. Of the multiple awards, I will mention only this because probably this is the most important. Everything else becomes less in front of this. And presently, he is the treasurer of All India Ophthalmical Society, treasurer of SARC Academy of Ophthalmology, general secretary of ISCR AKS, and treasurer of Eye Bank Association of India, and past general secretary of Delhi Ophthalmical Society. And probably I've heard this talk, but I will hear it again because it was a very interesting talk he gives on this topic. Please, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Love. Actually, yes, you have heard it once when we had a meeting, I guess, in close to Kolkata. Yeah. So, but a little bit, I mean, that was something with the practitioners actually. So here I will be focusing more on to the students and where is my slide? Okay. So is my slide visible?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Okay. So at the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Satyajit Sinha and Dr. Love Coach Gave. I mean, this is a wonderful idea that Dr. Satyajit has, started to, get some important topics taught and discussed by teachers to all the students. And I mean, it's always good to interact. Being a teacher myself, I am always very happy when, the students are around. I don't know from what happens on the other side, but for me, it's really a very nice moment. So I'll be discussing with you about corneal cross-linking. Now, what is corneal cross-linking? Cross-linking means that in the cornea you have collagen fibrils, and you want to have more of linking or more of bond between the collagen. Why do you want to have that bond? Because the cornea is weak, and in conditions like keratoconus, when the cornea is weak, you want to strengthen the cornea, make it strong, have more bonding between the collagen so that the cornea does not become more ectatic. And how do you do it? You do it with the use of UV rays and riboflavin. Now, riboflavin has dual action. It acts as a photosensitizer for production of oxygen-free radicals. And these oxygen-free radicals, they are the ones that increase the covalent bond, cause interlinking between the fibrils, and that makes the cornea stronger. And further, it also absorbs excess UV rays so as to protect the lens and the endothelium and the retina. The indications, as I said, of cross-linking is condition wherein you have a weak cornea like progressive keratoconus or post-classic ectasia or pellucid marginal degeneration. And then there are some other indications which have been emerging for quite some time now, and like microbial keratitis, corneal melts, and bullous keratopathy. But only in a few of microbial keratitis it has shown some promise. Otherwise, it is not that effective in most of the other conditions. But yes, can be considered. And many studies are being done these days so as to know whether it is really useful or not. So as I said that the primary indication of corneal cross-linking is a progressive keratoconus. So we should understand what is progression. What is a progressive keratoconus and what does progression mean? So progression means that over a period of 6 months, if the Kmax value increases by more than 1 diopter, if the difference between Kmax and Kmin is more than 1 diopter, if the pachymetry is decreasing by more than 2% in the central cornea, if the manifest refractive spherical equivalent is changing by more than 0.5 diopters over a period of 6 months, these all are the signs of progression. Now, when we see all these points, then we start feeling that probably, these are the indications for cross-linking. But if somebody has, one element, one of the variables there, maybe the manifest refraction is changing by 0.75, but the other things are not changing, whether we will call it progressive or not. And then there was a lot of confusion about it. And then there was a global consensus formed on when we will call it as a progression in ectasia. And if we have out of these, the progressive steepening of anterior corneal surface, progressive steepening of posterior corneal surface, and progressive thinning of the cornea, any two of these, if they are there, this means that this is a sign of an active progression of the disease. And then we should do cross-linking. So how do you do it? There are certain surgical steps. You do it in a sterile operating room. Then you put paracaine eye drops 5 minutes before the procedure, and you keep putting it 3-4 times so that the cornea gets anesthetized. Then you clean and drape the patient, put a speculum, scrape the epithelium with a spatula, and then keep putting riboflavin for every 5 minutes for 30 minutes. And then you examine the patient on slit lamp to see the aqueous flare. Most of the times the flare is there. And then you focus the UV lamp, the UV rays by this UV lamp. Now the UV lamp is at a distance, UV lamp is at a distance of about 50 millimeter from the cornea. that is not necessary. It may be, 48, it may be 52. The idea is that when you reach close to that, what you have to see is the focus of the beam. If the beam is sharply focused like this, a sharp circle, then it is a correct focus. But if it's too far, then you will have a fuzzy margin. If you're too close, you will have multiple circles. So this is the sign that you have focused it well. Why do you want to focus it well? Because if you are too far, then the UV rays will not be, penetrating the stroma adequately. And if you are too close, then the UV rays may penetrate too deep, and it may not have an effect on the stroma, but it can damage the endothelium as well. So for optimal effect, you should have a proper focus. Now, this is how we do it. 7mm circular cutting trephine is used to mark the epithelium. Once you have marked, then you debride this part of the epithelium. You don't debride the whole of cornea. You just debride the central 7mm for a case of keratoconus. Once you have debrided the epithelium completely, then you keep putting riboflavin every 5 minutes for 30 minutes. And then once you have done that, you focus UV rays onto the cornea for 30 minutes and you keep putting riboflavin every 5 minutes. So the total procedure is of 1 hour. So it's a long procedure. Many studies, so far I'm just mentioning one or two, but there are hundreds of studies which have shown that corneal cross-linking is an effective procedure, and it is now an established modality to halt the progression of keratoconus. This is what you get in anterior segment OCT. This is a demarcation line. Can you see this line? Here also, and in this picture also, you can see a demarcation line. This demarcation line denotes that the cross-linking was found to be effective, and effective till the anterior two-thirds of the cornea. So this is this sign, this demarcation line suggests. Now, just a word about post-LASIK ectasia. As I said, in keratoconus, it is very useful. Another indication is post-LASIK ectasia. In post-LASIK ectasia, the effect is not as good as in primary keratoconus. Why? Because cross-linking, occurs predominantly in anterior two-thirds of cornea, as I showed in the demarcation line. Now, as you know that in LASIK, flap does not contribute to the strength of the cornea. If you are strengthening the flap, it will not strengthen the cornea fully. So part of flap is strengthened and then underlying stroma is strengthened. So the effect is not as much, the strengthening effect is not as much as seen in primary keratoconus. Now cross-linking can be combined with some procedures like photorefractive keratectomy, like intracorneal ring segment or toric ICL. Now, in you can combine photorefractive keratectomy. Now, PRK is mostly used for refractive procedure for correction of refractive error. Now, but in keratoconus, the PRK that is done is not meant for complete correction of refractive error, because the patient is very high myope and the cornea is very weak. So that is not the idea. The idea is to make the cornea a little regular so that you can fit in the contact lens properly. The patient can have a good vision after that with contact lens. So just to do a minimal ablation and then do cross-linking, so you have regularized the surface and then you have strengthened it. And that is what is needed in cases of keratoconus, so that you can provide refractive correction in the form of contact lens, in the form of phakic implant, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do it, so that your cornea is regular and you provide a better quality and quantity of vision in these cases. Now, intracorneal ring segment is again an important tool to reduce the astigmatism in keratoconus. You can reduce the astigmatism. You can also take care of the some of the spherical power as well. Now, intracorneal ring segment, basically it is a ring which is introduced into the cornea at 70% depth. So you have to create a track. So either you can create a track for this ring either manually by sort of a keratome, or you can use a femtosecond laser. So this is a femtosecond laser assisted creation of track. Now the track is, there's a radial incision, so you open that and then you open the initial part of the track of the created by the femtosecond laser on one side, and then you open on the other side as well. And once you have opened the track on both sides, then you place the this is the intracorneal ring segment that is introduced into the cornea at a depth of 70% thickness. And so the basic idea is that these ring segments, once you have put it, they cause central flattening. So there is some decrease in myopia as well as astigmatism. Now in keratoconus, in myopia you place regular segment, but in keratoconus most of the time you have high astigmatism. So you place asymmetric segment, means asymmetric thickness of the ring segment, so that you correct astigmatism more. And then once you have done it, you debride the central part of the epithelium, put riboflavin, and then focus UV rays and do a cross-linking. So this is something that is quite useful in cases of keratoconus. And then after that, if the patient has high refractive error, then you can further treat the patient, further do the refractive correction by either toric phakic implant, or you can use a mini scleral contact lens. Now, cross-linking now is an established modality for preventing the progression of keratoconus. But there are certain issues. One is that it is a long duration. It is a 1 hour duration. Another issue is that you debride the epithelium so the patient can have pain. And the third issue is that if the cornea is very thin, then you have risk of damaging the endothelium. So people started thinking about, reducing the pain by, doing a transepithelial CXL without debriding the epithelium. So the patients had less symptoms, but most of the studies have found out that the effect was not as good because there is insufficient riboflavin penetration, and it is a compromise between efficacy and epithelial integrity. And the demarcation line was quite shallow, and it has been shown to be less effective. And many of these studies have shown that transepithelial PRK is not as effective as epithelium of PRK. Then some people tried different ways of increasing the riboflavin penetration by doing crisscrossing of epithelial debridement. So this is a method of crisscrossing of epithelial debridement. You do crisscross debridement so that the pain is less and the epithelium heals fast. That is the basic aim. But again, in these cases also, it was found that the patient still had pain and the result was not good. Some people have done, left the epithelium over the area which is thinnest and then debrided the epithelium all around. But it was found that the demarcation line was not visible under the area where the epithelium was not debrided. So the effect was not as good in that area because riboflavin did not penetrate. So finally, the punchline is that cross-linking is established, but we had discussed about three limitations. One was pain. So the patient will have to have pain because epithelium has to be debrided in order to have good efficacy. So the first point is this, that the epithelium has to be debrided. The second thing is that the limitation is that it is a long duration. 1 hour duration. So people thought of reducing it. So there's a Bunsen-Roscoe law of reciprocity. This is what it is. So it is basically the photochemical effect of radiation is proportional to the total energy delivered, irrespective of intensity and total time. So you just see that 30 minutes for 3 milliwatt per centimeter square for 30 minutes is the energy that is delivered while we are putting UV rays in conventional cross-linking. So people thought of increasing the power of this 3 milliwatt per centimeter square, and so that accordingly you can multiply based on Bunsen-Roscoe law, you can reduce the time. So 9 milliwatt per centimeter square for 10 minutes. And if you just reduce it, increase it by 10 times, you can reduce it by 10 times here also. So 30 milliwatt per centimeter square for 3 minutes was the one that people started using. And the final idea was that we should provide 5.4 joule per centimeter square of energy. But what happened that the results were not as good as the conventional cross-linking of 3 milliwatt per centimeter square for 30 minutes. So then people did a study that let's see whether accelerated cross-linking is as effective or not, and they used closest to this has a comparable efficacy. So 9 milliwatt per centimeter square for 10 minutes is something that people use for accelerated cross-linking these days in order to have a similar efficacy as in conventional cross-linking. So, and the third point is that if the cornea is thin, then what will you do? Because there is risk of damage. So people thought that let's swell up the cornea. Let's use hypoosmolar riboflavin. The cornea will swell up, and then we will save the endothelium. The distance of UV rays from the endothelium will increase. So they did this, but they found out that the results were not as good. Why? Because it is paradoxical. You are separating the collagen lamellae, and then again you want to have a compaction and bonding. So these are paradoxical things. So the results were there. It's not that the result was not there. There was some improvement in the strength of the cornea. There was some flattening, and there was some effect seen. But the results were not comparable to the conventional cross-linking. Now, then people thought that in order to increase that gap between the endothelium and the UV rays, people use bandage contact lens, smile lenticule, etc. But again, these will not be as effective as conventional, because the cross-linking works in anterior two-thirds of cornea, and part of it is being taken by the bandage contact lens or the smile lenticule, and that will be thrown later, discarded later. So the effect is only in limited thickness of the cornea, so the result was not very good. Now, so this is one study on contact lens assisted CXL, and they found that the result was not as good. Now, if we at RP Center have given a thesis to one of my candidates, what we do is that what we thought that in a thin cornea, if we place an intrastromal lenticule and increase the thickness and do cross-linking, then not only the tectonic strength of the cornea will increase, the thickness of the cornea will increase, but it will also reduce the chance of damage to endothelium, and this intrastromal lenticule will remain there and will be incorporated in the cornea. So this is how we do it. Now, the initial results are encouraging in some of the cases. In some cases, the results are not good. Obviously, we will keep analyzing the cases, and it'll take some time. But what I have felt is that in cases wherein you don't have a corneal scar, but this may be an alternative, but we have to work more on it. Now, how do you do it? A femtosecond laser is used to create a cleavage, and then a side cut, and then you do dissection. It is just like SMILE that we do for refractive procedure. So we do dissection of the stroma, and then we also inject the after doing dissection, we inject the riboflavin into the track and keep it for 1 minute. Then also put the riboflavin over the surface, and then the lenticule that we use is dissected from a donor lenticule. So a 200 micron donor lenticule is dissected. It is kept in riboflavin for 1 minute. Then it is trephined first. After creating the lenticule, it is trephined. The size that we use these days is 7 millimeter. So 7 millimeter trephine is used to create this. It is kept in riboflavin for 1 minute, and then it is introduced into the stroma. Intracorneal implantation is done. So this is how it is implanted inside, and then it is stretched. It is spread all around so that there is no fold in the lenticule, and then we use you check that there's no fold in the lenticule, and then you use riboflavin UV rays to do cross-linking. And 9 milliwatt per centimeter square is being used for 10 minutes in these cases. And this is how it looks like on day 1. So the lenticule is there, the strength increases, and it allows you to do cross-linking in such cases, and further increases the tectonic strength of the cornea. Another concept that is coming up is customized cross-linking, and customized cross-linking has been again propagated by Professor Theo Seiler. His concept is that you have, this is the topography of a case of keratoconus, right? Now you have this area which is very weak, but this area is not very weak at all. So why subjecting this area to unnecessary, subjecting this area to UV rays and riboflavin, etc. So let's subject this area more and this area less. So this is customization of, radiation, customization of UV radiation. So what they did was they created three circles like this. This is the innermost circle, and then you have the outer circle, and then the outermost circle. The inner circle was subjected to a total energy of 10 joule per centimeter square. Intermediate circle was subjected to a total energy of 7.2 joule per centimeter square. And the outer circle was subjected to a total energy of 5.4 joule per centimeter square. And this is how they did it. And the initial results, they are showing that the initial results are good and quite encouraging. So let's hope only with time we'll be able to know whether the results are really very good and better than the conventional cross-linking. Another innovation that is coming up is based on the fact that what people felt, that when the cornea is subjected to UV rays, then in the intrastromal concentration of oxygen reduces significantly. It gets depleted and it becomes zero after some time. Then if it becomes zero, how will you get the singlet oxygen to increase the cross-linking between the stroma? So people thought that if we, provide oxygen from outside, increase the concentration of the oxygen surrounding the cornea, it will diffuse into the cornea, and we will have more oxygen intrastromally, and then more singlet oxygen will be released, and there will be better strength, better cross-linking of the cornea. So this is what people have done some animal study, and I had also started this study just recently at RP Center, the human study, but unfortunately because of the corona pandemic, it has got halted. But this is the basic concept why we are planning to provide oxygen, because if you have more oxygen, more singlet oxygen will be released, and there will be better cross-linking. So let's see, with time we'll be able to know whether the oxygen supplementation from outside will increase the covalent bonding and will increase the strength of the cornea or not. Then there are some other indications of cross-linking. As I said earlier, that in microbial keratitis, cross-linking has been used because it is UV ray, and people know that UV rays is used to sterilize the many things, so it can kill the organism, and it can work. So it has been found to be effective in some of the small bacterial corneal ulcers. However, there is no effect seen in fungal ulcers, so it should not be done. In bacterial ulcers, yes, there has been some effect. Some results have shown some effect in these cases. Then people have also done cross-linking in bullous keratopathy because the basic idea was to debride the epithelium and increase cross-linking in the superficial stroma, so that the fluid from the deep stroma does not percolate up, does not come up, and does not cause epithelial bully, and the patient will be symptom-free. However, most of the studies have found out that in cases where the corneal thickness is more than 800 millimeters, in those cases, 800 microns, sorry, in those cases, the results were not good. So in cases where the thickness is less than that, then most of the people would like to do, other things, and would like to do some transplants, etc. So finally, it started off well in bullous keratopathy, but it has died down because the indications are not many. So then I will just tell you a couple of complications of CXL. Sometimes you can have a post-CXL haze, which persists for some time. for a month, for 2 months. You put topical steroid drops and gradually it fades off. But studies have shown that permanent stromal haze has been reported in 7 to 8% of cases. So that is something that one should be careful. And if you see haze in the early post-op period, start topical steroid to, you know, to reduce the intensity of haze. Then keratitis has been seen because you put bandage contact lens. Once you have debrided the epithelium, done cross-linking, you put bandage contact lens. And then sometimes because of lack of proper hygiene, because of the commensals coming into act, and bandage contact lens is there, less oxygen to the cornea, there is some risk of keratitis. And there are reports of post-CXL keratitis in the literature, and we have also seen. So we have to be careful. The basic idea is that once you have done cross-linking, the patient has to be followed meticulously, every day for the next 3 to 4 days, so that by the time epithelium heals, you are free, you can remove the bandage contact lens, and then the risk of keratitis reduces. So that is the basic idea. You see the patient on day 1, again see the patient on day 3, so that you intervene as early as possible if there is any evidence of keratitis. Then there can be, because of haze and because of some other reasons, there can be loss of visual acuity. It has been reported, but in very few cases. And cross-linking is an established modality, but it's not that cross-linking is successful in 100% of cases. It can fail in some of the cases. Some patients may not respond to it. Some patients may not show halt of progression, and so that is considered as a failure of cross-linking. So in conclusion, cross-linking, corneal cross-linking is an established modality now to arrest progression in keratoconus. It does reduce some amount of astigmatism as well, and that causes some amount of regularity in the cornea, so that your contact lens fitting improves. Various modifications have been done, like transepithelial, like accelerated, etc. And all these are done to improve efficacy, safety, and convenience of the patients. And newer indications are emerging, but only time will tell whether cross-linking is as effective and can be considered as an effective modality in treating all these conditions. So thank you very much for your patient listening and for your for your attention to what I told, what I discussed. And if you have any query related to this, I will be more than happy to.
One patient called me today only and asked about the urgency of the procedure
Okay.
once it is diagnosed.
Let me just unshare the slide. How can you do it? Okay. Stop sharing. Actually, many times, there's a wrong way of portraying. Sometimes, people are told that, it is a thinning, keratoconus is a thinning disorder. And if you don't treat it, if you don't do cross-linking, it will burst. So it is not a fact. It will not burst. Yes, it is an established modality and it should be done in cases where it is indicated, but it is not not such an emergency that you have to do it within 48 hours, within 72 hours, or else cornea will burst. This is not a correct method.
It's a slow progressing disorder.
Yeah.
Not only that,
And,
it progresses in only about 25% of patients. So in 75%, it's not progressive.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, people do CXL only because somebody else has not done CXL before, and it is a keratoconus.
Yeah. That's true.
And what about corneal haze in when you put the lenticule in such cases? Does it happen?
Yes. In a couple of cases, we found that the haze was there in the lenticule. And initially I used to put it, there was no guideline for the duration of riboflavin on the lenticule. So it was left for some time longer. So somehow I felt that probably that is the reason, although it is just a speculation and just a thought. I don't have a proof evidence for that. But now I am very strict in, there are two things. One is that young donor tissue should be used, not very old. Otherwise, the risk of haze is there. The second thing is that riboflavin should, that lenticule should not be left in riboflavin so that, for very long, in the feeling that, there should be more and more riboflavin should get into the lenticule. So that is what I felt that, as 1 minute is the directive for the intrastromal, riboflavin. Similarly, I keep the lenticule also in riboflavin for 1 minute, and then I introduce inside, and then do this thing. Haze, yes, initially haze is also because of the increase in the thickness of the lenticule. So that thickness reduces the edema. Lenticule as such is a little edematous because most of the times we use lenticule which is of slightly suboptimal quality, not for which cannot be used for DSEC or DMEC, right? So the stroma is in itself is a little edematous, and when you put it inside, it increases further. So on day one, a 200 micron thickness. What normally I do, I ablate the central part. So I create a hyperopic lenticule. So suppose it's a 200 in the periphery and 130 in the center. It increases on day one. But with time, it starts decreasing and it reduces down to from 130. Like if it's a 200 micron lenticule, I have ablated 70 microns in the center, so it became 130. So in 6 months' time, I found out that this 130 reduces down to 78, 80 microns. 80 microns is the average. In the center and periphery, it comes down to 130. So the basic idea is that it will have an intact-like effect also, as a reverse geometry kind of thing, and the other thing is that it increases tectonic strength, and most importantly, it allows you to do cross-linking without discarding the lenticule that you are using. Like the lenticule, smile lenticule, or the BCL that is used in thin corneas for doing cross-linking, it is discarded. And we know that cross-linking works only in anterior two-third of cornea, anterior two-third of the thickness that is subjected to UV rays. So then the strength is not. I mean, this is something that I can just tell you the hypothesis. The study will only prove whether the hypothesis has been accepted or rejected or whatever. So this is the hypothesis based on which I am doing this study.
And Dr. Mamta, she wants to know that at what depth do we create the stromal pocket for intrastromal lenticule, and do we use long-term steroid as we do in cases of transplant?
Not really long-term steroid. The depth is 120 microns. So we create the pocket at 120 microns depth. And we do use steroid initially frequently. And as the thickness of the lenticule reduces and as the haze clears up, we reduce the topical steroid. And maybe a fluorometholone can be given once a day. Once a day. Now, stromal rejection, risk of stromal rejection is there. That is true. But we all know that the incidence of stromal rejection is very minimal. So if we can have, it is not an alternative to DALC or anything as well. So if we can delay keratoplasty, if we can strengthen the cornea, delay keratoplasty, have a good visual rehabilitation by use of contact lens, etc. Because whatever cases we have done after that, all the patients were tolerant to contact lens. So these things also matter. So this cannot be considered as an alternative to DALC, but this definitely will delay keratoplasty for a long period. I mean, this is what we feel. Time will tell.
And there is another question. User's name is not written. Can you please again tell us intact in keratoconus when combined with CXL?
Okay. So intracorneal ring segment can be implanted. The basic idea is to have a central flattening effect of the ring segment, right? So it causes central flattening, and when we use asymmetric segments, it reduces the astigmatism. In keratoconus, we have astigmatism. In post-LASIK ectasia, we do have astigmatism. So most of the times, It was actually the intracoronary ring segment were introduced for low myopia up to 3 diopter of myopia, and it was approved by FDA also. But in these cases, in cases of keratoconus, you have more of astigmatism. So I use asymmetric segment. Asymmetric means asymmetric thickness of the segments, so as to reduce the astigmatism. Now, once you have placed the ring segment, you debride the epithelium inside the inside, since it is placed at 7 millimeter zone. Now, if you place it a little inside, like somewhere where you use, if you use Ferrara ring, etc., where you use it at 4 millimeter, then you have to debride the central part as well as the cornea outside the ring. But for Intacs, you just have to debride the central part within the ring, over the ring, but inside the ring, and then do accelerated cross-linking. And I normally do these days for accelerated cross-linking, I use 9 milliwatt per centimeter square for 10 minutes. Because studies have shown that its result is similar to the conventional cross-linking.
And the next question you had already covered, but I will just read it out. What is the amount of epithelial debridement to be done in cross-linking? And is there any rim of epithelium left behind? That you had already told.
Yes, of course, rim is definitely left behind. Initially, people were using 7 millimeter, 8 millimeter, 9 millimeter, but now everybody, has, come to, the 7 millimeter, and everybody debrides center 7 millimeter, and then put riboflavin every 5 minutes, and then after that, the cornea.
And there is another question: how long should we wait before doing a repeat cross-linking, if needed?
It is a very difficult question, actually. That how long should we wait for a repeat? See, if a patient does not have any response to cross-linking, this patient will not have response even by repeat cross-linking. Now, repeat cross-linking has always been done to potentiate the effect of the earlier cross-linking. So people have done it early also, after say 6 weeks and 3 months as well, to have an additive effect. And people have repeated it after 1 year or 2 years as well. Now, there's a general consensus, or there's a general feeling that after 5 to 6 years time, the effect of cross-linking will wane off. There's no definitive guidelines for it, but people think that if beyond 5-6 years, and if it has, after a halt of progression, again it has started progressing, then you can again go ahead and do it.
So, do you feel that since it is a very easy procedure, is it being misused or being advised more when it is not required also?
Muscati sir had already made that statement that
I have very, very strong feelings on this. I have seen innumerable patients in whom there was really no need. There is no documented progression. At least there must be some documented progression. Even a retinoscopy or a spectacle number change, even if you don't want to do topos and pentacams, at least show me that the spectacle number, astigmatism has changed. Something you show me. Everything is continuously constant. Patient is seeing 6/9 as he was all the time, and still he is subjected to this. I've been observing the patient for 5 years and not doing anything to him. Suddenly he goes to somebody XYZ who and gets a cross-linking done because they said if you don't do it tomorrow, it will progress and you'll get eye drops. So only 25% of the patients ever progress. Others need only careful watching.
Yeah, that is true.
So another question is cost. What is the cost of cross-linking?
I think Rajesh does it in an institute, so the cost doesn't really matter there. But for those who are doing it outside, there are two ways. One is that you have your own. If you got a high volume, then you can keep the machine itself. It's not all that expensive. Even the riboflavin now is made in India, Atmanirbhar. But in Mumbai, for example, we have a traveling cross-linking machine with riboflavin. So the engineer comes, sets it up, he charges you a rental for the machine. So even if I do one cross-linking in 6 months, it doesn't matter because I pay per use. And I think that is the model that we should have across the country. Either you can have a company.
It's available in Calcutta also, sir. Similar
yes.
model.
So either or in smaller places, if it's not available, if one person purchases it, maybe he should allow others to use it in a neutral center or something so that he also gets his money back that much faster. Otherwise, you're tempted to cut corners and do every second carrot corners that comes to you because you own the machine and the interest is building up. So it's better to allow multiple users on a machine in whichever way you do this. Then the cost is not a problem.
Absolutely. As such, also, it's not a very costly.
Not expensive.
And,
what is more expensive is the intracorneal ring segments. Those are
Yeah.
expensive because
Yeah.
we tried making it in India, it didn't work. So we still have to import these. And
Yeah.
these are pretty expensive. And it burns
Yeah.
your heart sometimes when you have to remove them.
Yeah, yeah. What I have felt is that in order to reduce cost in intracorneal ring segments, instead of using two
Yeah. You're frozen a little.
We lost Rajesh.
Yeah, but what he meant to say is that instead of using two, many times you can use a single asymmetric ring segment because what you're interested in regularizing the astigmatism and making the cone central. So if with a ring segment you can make the cone central, then you won half the battle in a keratoconus because then contact lenses fit that much better, quality of vision improves. A central cone is much better than an eccentric cone. So sometimes you can reduce costs instead of having two ring segments, you can do with just one. This is, I'm just using telepathy from Rajesh's brain because everything else is frozen. Yeah. Love, is there another question?
No, sir, it's complete.
Okay. We'll leave Rajesh in this action pose. Yeah.
I'll just take 1 minute. Hello. Hello.
Doesn't matter, Satya.
Okay.
If we've answered all the questions, then we can call it an evening. Yeah.
I want to profusely thank you, sir, for your presentation today. And I just wanted to add one more thing, because you are so closely associated with Family Benefit Scheme. You wrote a small paragraph about a doctor joining FBS. Recently, you had put it on all the groups. And I got so motivated with it that Pooja and I have joined today the FBS scheme.
Very good. Very good.
We made the payment today.
So it's important that those who are between 49 and 56 years of age, this is your last and final chance to ever join FBS AIS because the scheme is only meant for those below 49 with tremendous amount of political pressure from the bigwigs in AIOS. We opened it till 30th of June. That date is only 4 days away. So those who wish to join FBS AIOS and they are between that magic figures of 49 and 56 years, please join in the next 3-4 days because after that, we will not open it again. We've decided to develop stronger spines from 30th June onwards. We will not bow to pressure. So last and final chance. Those who are young, below 49, can join even after 30th June. We have no problem. Thank you, Satya. Thank you.
Sir, one minute, sir. Rajesh is coming, sir.
Okay.
He'll just join and then his network had got disconnected. He said he's just joining in back.
Yeah. He'll reboot his system. While he's joining, I will continue on my pet theme, Satya, since you made me talk about the FBS. So we've done, it's vetted by an actuary who are the people who are insurance experts. And they have sworn that this is the best term insurance program in the market for two reasons. One is that this is the only term insurance where the beneficiary, later he dies, the more the money he gets. If somebody died in 2004 when the scheme was launched, he got 50,000 rupees as death benefit to his nominees. If somebody dies today, he gets 23 lakhs of benefit to his nominees. And this is the more the members who join, the more attractive we can make it.
Yeah.
So no term insurance has this scheme. Every term insurance tells you this is a fixed amount that somebody will get. While here it keeps on increasing. Secondly is that the amount you pay per year, in every other term insurance, it is fixed that you will pay X amount per year. While here you are paying 600 rupees per death of a member. When we took an average of the last 12 years, we found that the average that you're paying was less than 4,000, about 3,700 per year is what the average member has been paying. And it is irrespective of your seniority or when you join. Everybody pays 600 rupees per death of members. So if 10 people die, you will pay 6,000 rupees in a year. And that amount also will reduce as membership increases. So we'll make it instead of 600, we might make it 300 rupees per death. So reducing the amount you pay every year reduces, the amount you get at the end when for your nominees increases. So for these two things which are flexible, no scheme in India is as flexible as this. Also, we've allowed an exit clause. If you have a grievous illness, cancer or something, and you need money rapidly, and you've completed the X amount of years, 12 years in the scheme, then you can exit the scheme and we will give you some amount of money. I think it's 4 lakhs to exit the scheme at any time you need for medical emergency.
मनीष जी था, डॉक्टर राजेश को अलाउ कर दीजिए, एंट्री उनका रुका हुआ है. मनीष गुप्ता जी.
It is open sir.
तो सर का दिखा नहीं रहा है सर.
He's coming now sir.
Okay.
So your mic is on mute. Unmute your mic.
Allowed entry.
Raise the please. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Rajesh.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to give one example that I had a case of keratoconus wherein, I had used Intact. So the patient had an astigmatism of 10 diopters, 9.5 actually. And I used asymmetric segment in that patient. The astigmatism reduced down to 4.5, from 9.5 to 4.5. And then I used a toric ICL and the patient is very happy. So toric ICL for high myopia and the remaining astigmatism. And because for 8.5, 9.5 astigmatism, it is very difficult to get any, ICL you won't get, and even if you want to customize Indian phakic implant,
it becomes difficult. Yeah. It was good while it lasted. So what Rajesh meant to say that even for an IPCL or an Indian implant, it's difficult to customize it like this and the results are not all that great. So if you can reduce the astigmatism by asymmetrical ring segments, Rajesh.
Yeah. Something is going wrong. But fortunately, it happened only at the end.
Yes.
So ICL, toric ICL to take care of, it worked well in that case. So,
good.
I think it, the network is telling that my time is over.
I would really like to take this opportunity to thank both Dr. Quresh Maskati and Dr. Rajesh Sinha for their amazing presentations. And I want all the postgraduates to know what a strong pillar of AIUS Dr. Quresh Maskati has been, and Professor Rajesh Sinha, who is the treasurer right now. I just want to relate a small story that when I had finished post-graduation and I met Dr. Rajesh Sinha many years back once in Delhi, and I requested him that I want to make a presentation in DOS. And then I didn't see him or heard from him for 6 months. And then suddenly out of the blue, I got a call from him saying, you had told me in that conference that you want to make a presentation. That time I was junior and I had just joined. And I was so touched by his gesture that he remembered that I had told him and requested him for this. So he's a very true and genuine human being and a very true and very affectionate friend. I'm very, very grateful to him for having taken out time today. I'm very grateful to Dr. Quresh Maskati also. I'm very grateful to Dr. Love Kochgave, who took out time to moderate this session today. This is going to be in the library for the postgraduates to see repeatedly around the world, and they will be cherishing this presentation every time they have to go for an exam and viva. They'll be using this recordings to see and make their presentations much more better. Thank you so much once again for everybody, and most
Thank
of
you.
all,
Thank you.
I want to thank Intas Pharmaceuticals, Manish ji and Chandrasekhar ji, who make this possible every day. For the last 2 months, they have been doing this every day from 5 to 6:30 p.m., where we have been covering different topics. And we are very grateful to Intas for doing this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you,
Sir.
everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Love. And of course, I think, am I off?
No, thank you. Thank you.
We are-
We are
there.
live.
No, no, we are here.
Okay, okay. And it was a nice company of Dr. Quresh also. I guess he has left. So,
Yeah.
so it was a nice, overall, nice get together kind of. So
Thank you so much. Thank
keep
you.
doing many more
Thank